Hello, hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Nick, and with me today is 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿, how you doing?
Okay, chilling out in Wyoming.
Yeah. Well, I know you've been taking the SCOTUS decisions really hard, and I want to let you know that. Well, we're taking your conservatism. I think we need to distribute it amongst the less fortunate, and we need to, that was I'm stealing that from Titan. Actually, that was a joke he had made. But at any rate, welcome everyone to After Dark. Open hang. Anyone who wants to come in? I mean, the main topic tonight is going to be obviously what's been going on with SCOTUS. Anyone who wants to join us, you can come in. I haven't actually brought up the call-in line. People haven't been using that recently, so sometimes that gets pretty active, sometimes it doesn't. If somebody just wants to use their phone and dial in, let me know in the live chat, and I can get you in. Otherwise, if you want to come into the hang, and I should actually pin it. I'll pin a link, but it's live.intimeshow.com. You can come in from any web browser, any phone, any device. All you really need is a mic, but if you got a camera, you can do that too. Grew up in Wyoming, did you?
Yep, Lander, Wyoming.
Yep. Oh, I got something for you. Here you go.
Life finds a way.
Yeah, Titan told it 10 times better. Yep. Oh, and by the way, In Time is going to be hosting Discord classes. If any of you feel you need a little help, especially if you're modding or administrating a Discord and you're not quite sure how it operates, In Time will be hosting Discord modding and management classes. Anybody who wants that, just for if it helps you figure out how to chat, moderate, or even just stay on a Discord, we would be happy to help you guys out. We'll be starting that inside joke. All right. Well, anyways, anyone who wants to join, you guys can come on in. Again, it's live.intimeshow.com, or let us know and we can bring up the phone and you guys can just call in. It's entirely up to you. So a lot going on, and I know you've been following 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿. I know you've also seen the other shows and saw what we did today. I have actually really, obviously, we all share the same opinion on.
This is wrong.
Yes, that's exactly why you have me on it, because we all share the same opinions on this.
Well, and it was the sound on the inside is a little quiet. We just had Morgan Freeman saying, "This is wrong." Yeah, I got to be a little careful with Titan, because if he wants to make me pay for this, he can absolutely make me pay. I told my wife the whole thing. She laughed her ass off, and I said, "Yeah." Titan said, "This is war." And I was just like, which is bad, because I will lose. I will absolutely lose. There's no question about that. And all right, so yeah, what are your thoughts? I will try to keep the coughing under control, and I'll try to be a little faster on the mute button there. So what are your thoughts on all of this very? We agreed at least in one thing. I mean, this is I've never seen or even heard of, that I can recall, a Supreme Court that was, whether you like it or not, whether you're for it or against it, that did this much in a single term. It's really just huge. It's a lot. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, they really seem to take the old blacksmithing adage, strike while the iron is hot, to heart. They've been quite active and doing quite a lot of things, and some of them, we always talk about, we have this conservative 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿 on, and recently there's been a lot of things going on that I'm like, well, if you are really a conservative, you should have problems with this too. It's not just a liberal issue. This is a threat to a republic type of issue, and so it seems like over the last couple of months, I've been finding myself, annoyingly enough, agreeing with you on so many different things.
My condolences.
And that has got to stop. So Today, I'm going to reaffirm that I am, in fact, a conservative because I've always maintained that I'm socially very liberal. And
Yes.
when it comes to like the size, scope, role of government, fiscal responsibility or fiscal policies, things like that, of that nature, I'm very conservative. I believe that the founding documents were that this country and the way this country was put together originally, with a few exceptions, was a brilliant piece of work. It was something that had never really been tried before, self-governance. And I think that they did, especially for the times, they did an amazing job. I mean, we've endured for almost 250 years now, so this is a pretty big deal in my opinion. And so when it comes to the size, role, scope of government, I want at the federal level, I want a small government that doesn't do much. It's like I've always kind of thought that the government was there to do essentially three things. Things that the states either couldn't do on their own or shouldn't be allowed to do on their own, such as immigration policies, stopping wars, defense of the country, etc. We shouldn't expect a single state to shoulder the burden of doing that, nor should we want a single state to do that. An arbiter between the many states, which is one of the reasons the Commerce Clause exists, to keep commerce regular, not to regulate, but to keep it regular between the states. So, a state like New York or New Hampshire couldn't choke off the other states around it because all goods would have to travel through those states to get to states on either side of them. So you don't want states deciding they're going to hold a grudge. You don't want New York saying, well, screw you, New England, you bunch of Massachusetts pansies need to learn your lesson. We're not going to let freight through, or we're going to put a tariff on all freight passing through, not terminating in the state, just to punish you. I mean, the federal government's there to stop those kinds of things. And it's there to ensure that individuals, especially minorities, rights aren't trampled by the majority opinion, to kind of put a curb on populism. Those were kind of the three roles I figured that our federal government, from all I can tell from reading all of the founding documents and all of the supplemental works, because the founders knew what they were doing was kind of new and innovative and untried, and they believed that people in the future would very much want to know the reasoning and stuff behind what they were talking about. They saved all of their correspondence. They made an effort to preserve all of this stuff so that we'd have a good idea of what their frame of thought was, what they meant by a lot of these things. So so that's how I figure, or I see the role of the federal government and the intent of the role of the federal government. The larger and more powerful the government gets, the more it tends towards despotism and a lack of liberty. It becomes more controlling, more dominating, more tyrannical. They saw that all throughout history, that this is what happens. So they sought to severely limit a federal authority and let the many states decide what they wanted to do about most of these issues. It specifically states in the Constitution, that if a authority is not directly granted to the federal government, then it is expressly denied the power. So if the Constitution is silent on an issue, that means the federal government has no authority to legislate on that issue that is a state's issue, unless the Constitution expressly forbids the states from it too. And then the right would be retained by the people. They made a point of putting that in there.
Yeah.
So, and also with the Ninth Amendment, they made a point of like, look, there's a lot of rights, and that the people retain all of these rights unto themselves. We can't list all of them. So they're going to retain all of these rights. The right of bodily autonomy, I think, rightfully falls under the Ninth Amendment. But,
so could you just quickly, for people who what does the Ninth Amendment say? Roughly,
you want me. You want me to actually quote everything, don't you?
No. Listen, I can answer it if you'd like. I'm just so people, because there's been a lot of people sitting there saying, well, if it's not a right given to you in the Constitution, but the Ninth Amendment actually says that there are rights that aren't given to you in the Constitution.
Yeah.
It's the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment is the one.
I want to get it exactly
okay.
right, because the Constitution is also written in a poetic way, which actually kind of annoys people. But they were writing it in poetry as well. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That is the Ninth Amendment, meaning that the citizens of the United States retained all of their rights, and that just because the Constitution didn't mention a specific right didn't mean that the people didn't retain that right. Essentially, unless there was something, a right that violated somebody else's rights, then you had the right to do it.
Yep,
And this is where I think that the right of bodily autonomy rightfully should rest in argumentation. Because look, and the right to privacy and all these. I don't know why they didn't specifically point to the Ninth Amendment and say, look, there's a lot of rights that exist. As a matter of fact, the people retain all of the rights unless specifically delegated to something else. Unless we specifically say something. And we pointed out a few that we thought were very important, and put them in the Bill of Rights. There was a bit of a discussion over whether the Bill of Rights should even be included, and this is the exact reason why. Is there's well, if you enumerate rights, well, then they're going to say, well, these are the rights you have and no others. And that wasn't the belief of the founders. They're no, the people are retaining all of their rights, all of them, unless we have specifically laid out where these rights may be curtailed. And so this was one of the things that they decided to put in the Bill of Rights to make it clear that just because we didn't mention this right doesn't mean you don't have it.
Yes. All right. So again,
so you were talking. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, please. I want to make sure that so I want to hear your answer about that. I mean, we framed it very nicely because I think these are the issues. So I wanted to hear more of the answer, but I think that's where you're headed. So I'll shut up.
I mean, you spent enough time. You should have just said what you were going to say initially. But so anyway, I believe that the role of the federal government is very, very limited. Expressly says that the powers of the federal government are few and enumerated. So if the power is not specifically enumerated in the Constitution, the federal government does not have the ability to do it, because you had made a complaint that with especially the SEC, well, one of many complaints that I'm going to address currently, was when the decision with the SEC and the newest one with the EPA, you're look, the court has now said that, well, these alphabet agencies do not have the power to legislate because Congress cannot delegate that power to anyone. The Constitution forbids Congress from being able to delegate its legislative powers to another body of unelected bureaucrats. So, they rejected it, and you say, well, this is pulling the teeth out of it, and you said, look, I can already see what's coming down the pike. So Congress is going to legislate something in the EPA, along the EPA rights, and then it's going to get challenged in court. It's going to come up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's going to go, I know that in the last decision we said that you can't delegate this power, which is true, and that was the decision that they were deciding upon, because they usually stop at the first thing that disproves the argument. They stop there. They don't generally keep going through the rest of the arguments. The first one is sufficient. So they didn't address any of the other ones. Well, now another case comes forth, and you said, well, now they're going to say, well, Congress, you don't have the authority to legislate this at all, and that's correct. They don't have the authority. It's so I see this. I agree with you in that's probably going to come down the pike later, and then they're going to stand up and say, well, you don't actually have the authority to legislate this at all, because the Constitution mentions nothing about the environment. Now, going back to my earlier thing, saying, because there's a very good argument as to why environmental policy ought to be a federally regulated, there ought to be a specific delegation of power to the federal government to be able to control this, because environmental factors affect everybody in the country, not just a state. So currently, I think that the only role that the legally, constitutionally, that the EPA should have is as an arbiter between disputing states over environmental policies. If Wyoming decides to fire up 30 more coal plants, Nebraska has a problem with that because the prevailing winds are blowing all that smoke into Nebraska, and now they're having beef between the states. Nebraska's saying, hey, you need to shut this stuff down. You're choking us out. And Wyoming's like, screw off, we need power, and this is the cheapest way to do it. Well, now the federal EPA now acts as an arbiter between the two, but they don't have any actual legal power to enforce anything. They're there to advise and offer policies that they think would be most beneficial, and then it would be up to the Congress to try and pass those things, which I then think will be challenged in court. Will end up hopefully end up at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would strike down Congress's ability to legislate, because that's not a power delegated to them.
So you're saying they should act as an advisory role instead of a regulatory one?
Well, they can come up with regulations, they can come up with best practices, they can come up with solutions, they can come up with policy plans, etc., to suggest to the legislature. That's, I think, the only power that they're really granted by the Constitution to be able to do, because Congress can't give them carte blanche, which they have done, to just make up a bunch of regulations that they can then enforce by law. I don't think they have the legal authority to enforce them legally against the states.
They do have that from Congress. They do have that from Congress. They do have that from Congress, but I agree in the interpretation that you're using. Congress can't actually, because that would actually be an abdication of, and they're not permitted to. They have both the right and the responsibility to make the laws. They cannot pass that on to somebody else. I think there's a difference between regulation
That's my point.
Okay, yeah, all right.
But they can still formulate all of these policies, and stuff, and give those recommendations, saying this is what we think should be done. We're the experts. This is what you hired us to figure it out, and so. Here's what we think you should do, and then Congress passes that legislation into law, to be enforced by the executive. And then, of course, it'll probably get challenged in court. Ostensibly, it would be challenged in court, go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court should strike it down, because Congress is not empowered by the Constitution to regulate environmental concerns at all. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. You can't find it anywhere. So, therefore, the U.S. government, federal government, doesn't have the authority to regulate it. Now, I've stated before that kind of the philosophy behind everything that I can understand from how the federal government was put together, and a philosophy that I believe in, the three areas that the federal government is there for. Well, there's some things that have come up that I think rightly fall under what would be the purview of the federal government. Something that either a single state either cannot nor should be doing on their own. There's some health issues, like, I don't know, maybe a pandemic or endemic virus pops up. That might be something that affects the whole of the country and would rightfully fall under a federal umbrella of authority, because we shouldn't expect a single state to shoulder all of the responsibility of trying to contain or deal with a pandemic, nor would we want a patchwork of 50 different policies for something that equally affects all of the country. I think there's a very good argument that should be in a federal power. It's not. The Constitution doesn't grant the federal government the authority to regulate those things, but it should. And since I think that there's broad agreement that it should, and these are new things that have popped up that probably, I hate to say a pandemic is a new thing, because, the Black Death happened. So, that was before the founding of the country. They were aware that things like this happened. They may not have had quite the idea of exactly what caused it, but they still didn't delegate any authority to the U.S. government to regulate this stuff. But they did offer a way for us to change the Constitution for changing times for new things. So when it comes to something like environmental protection policies, environmental protection was not a thing when the founding of the country. It wasn't on anybody's radar. Nobody thought it ever needed to be. The wilderness was wild and unexplored, and it was almost endless at that point. So nobody thought that there would be a need for environmental regulation to preserve the health and welfare of the planet for all of the people. It does extend globally, but we're concerned with the United States because that's all we have authority over right now.
Yeah.
So, in the United States, that's an important thing. It affects everybody in the United States. It affects the whole of the United States. So I think that there's a very good argument that this should be a federal power. Having 50 patchwork regulations on trying to protect the environment, probably not going to work out so great.
Yeah.
This is why they specifically included a measure to amend the Constitution. So if you want to do this and do it in a principled and rule of law way, you need to amend the Constitution. That is the way to do it. Don't just throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and hope that something sticks and that the people will continue to abdicate their responsibility to maintain their own rights and privileges and to keep a federal power in check, because they haven't had to deal with a tyrannical government themselves. So they've kind of went to sleep at the wheel and just let the government, let's let it be somebody else's problem. I don't want to deal with this.
So
that is how you erode the rule of law, and the rule of law is really critically important to civilization, because as soon as you lose at least the perception of the rule of law, civilization collapses. And you don't want that to happen.
That makes a lot of sense. And just to so I've got 2 points, but just to make sure that this dovetails correctly. So I think that's also sort of not just with the EPA, but you would, I think, that goes for same-sex marriage, same-sex relationships, all of these other things, which was essentially the argument that the court was in fact making, that it should be done through Congress. So assuming that all of that falls into the same umbrella, I have two objections. The first is that I do think that if they try to legislate it, you're going to get exactly what happened in the Dred Scott decision, which is they're going to say, well, if Congress tries to legislate it, they're going to say, well, no, Congress cannot say that you have a right to same-sex marriage. That's not something that Congress has the ability to do, so Congress won't be able to legislate it, and then you're going to actually, yes, you'll have to do the amendment. But here's the problem with the amendment. The last one that we really took a stab at was the ERA, for which there was actually broad consensus, and we still couldn't get it done. I understand why the bar for amending the Constitution is so high, and it should be, but when it comes to the EPA, the SEC, and at least the what was it called? Them alphabet
agencies.
Alphabet agencies. Thank you. When it comes to those, I mean, one of the reasons that they were given the powers that they were given is because Congress is absolutely deadlocked, and there's as broad agreement for raising the debt ceiling as you can find on any topic. And we still basically can't do that because it's constantly getting weaponized. So how is the EPA and how are the alphabet agencies going to be able to function if, in fact, they're going to be subject to much closer scrutiny by Congress, and they can't operate and they can't do any of the regulation without Congress? So that's my first objection. And then the second one is, how are we going to be able to pass?
Well, let's pause there for a second.
The answers may dovetail together, so they're
okay.
They're sort of, they're quasi, they're the same objection essentially, but so it's at that level. And then we have the same problem with passing a constitutional amendment. So if we're not going to grant these rights, and we're not going to say that they're rights that cannot be taken away from the states, like gay marriage, we'd have to pass the constitutional. We either do it through legislation, which we can't based on these rulings, or we do it through a constitutional amendment, but we can't even pass the ERA, which has had the most consensus of just about anything, and we couldn't pass it. So there you go. Those are the two objections.
Right, and you're using a consequentialist argument to nullify a principle argument. You're saying that, well, because Congress is deadlocked and not really getting things done, ergo we should undermine the rule of law to get the result that we want, instead of following the actual rules and regulations that we laid out, the rule of law.
I'm going to interrupt for one real quick sec. Sinister Porpoise is here, and so Sinister, I have one thing to say to you now that you've shown up in the live chat.
And war never changes.
Sorry, I've been waiting for that for a while. So I'm sorry. You were saying I'm using a consequentialist argument against an argument based on principle.
Correct. And this is where things get difficult, and this is where I will often struggle in very complex situations, such as, I don't know, maybe abortion. Excuse me. Because there are real consequences, and people will suffer those real consequences. So, the principle may be true and accurate and correct, and it can lead to a couple of negative things because of other problems. Usually it's always because of other problems that also need to be. So instead of correcting things the way that it should be done, and in this case, I'm going to blame the generalized American people for not holding their own politicians accountable, which brings up a whole nother host of problems. I mean, things are never as simple as you think they are. Things are so vastly complicated. It's like, for example, it's like, okay, that's a great argument. We have a problem with gerrymandering. That is an area you and I agree on absolutely and entirely. We've got a situation where politicians are picking their voters instead of picking their representative. That is a huge problem that needs to be addressed, because you can't. It's really hard to fix the other problems without fixing that one. So I recognize that there are other problems, but what we're doing, instead of following the rule of law and trying to fix what the actual fundamental problems that are preventing some things are, we're just throwing a bunch of stuff in contravention of the Constitution to see what we can get to stick to the wall to solve, to put a Band-Aid on the problem. The problem that you have when you do things like that is what happens with Roe v. Wade. They used a bunch of bad argumentation to justify this right, instead of specifically saying, look, the people retain all of the rights, and including among those things is the right to medical care, the right to bodily autonomy. All of these things can be found directly in the Ninth Amendment. It's like, just because it isn't explicitly listed in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have it. And this would be the argument that I'd use against, trying to repeal gay marriage. They may be able to do it, but a state trying to pass a law saying, well, you can't have gay marriage anymore, could be challenged constitutionally, because the right of the people to freedom of association is a well-known, established historic right, and is protected by the Ninth Amendment. I don't see how a state could get away with that, and so we should hold ourselves to the actual principles that the Constitution lays forth. And if we don't agree with them, then we need to amend the Constitution. We need to stop doing this. Let's end run around the Constitution, because it's degrading the rule of law. And societies collapse as soon as you lose the perception of the rule of law. And it tends to happen very, very slowly over a long period of time, and then all at once. So it seems like if you happen to be at the times where it does collapse, you're like, what the hell happened? It just seemed to suddenly fall apart. And it really didn't. It's been a history of undermining the rule of law forever. And it irritates me a little bit, and I get a little passionate about, we should be doing these things correctly so that we know that they can't be undermined later, and that we ourselves are not undermining the rule of law. It builds confidence in our actual fundamental institutions that is needed for our country to continue to exist. And if you are having problems with Congress being deadlocked, then get the hell out and vote for somebody else.
Well, so I think in principle I agree with about 90% of what you said, and the 10% I think is nuance that's probably not particularly apropos of what we're talking about now. But the problem is, so there's first of all, I mean, there's always going to be, human beings are messy creatures, and there's always going to be gray areas where things aren't done entirely the way they should have been, and there's may or may not be consequences. Sometimes you get away with it, sometimes you don't, and so I think the issue isn't was this done perfectly, but how far afield of the way it's supposed to be done was it, and is there any real justification for that? One of the problems is, and this gets back to, for me, actually, the fundamental problem, as I see it, is that we're a two-party country. And I think because we're a two-party country, it leads to polarization. I think that polarization has led to the state and Congress that we have now. I don't think that there is a way and especially gerrymandering, especially all of these other things that we've discussed, and now that's going to be coming up before the Supreme Court. Intellectually, I'm dying to know what they say, but aside from intellectually, I don't want this within 300 miles of this current Supreme Court because I don't know what they're going to do. But that notwithstanding, we are in a situation right now where the problem is I don't see a way. I mean, we have to vote. We have to vote better, and we have to vote these other people into Congress. I don't see a practical way for doing that anytime in the next 10 to 20 years. I don't know what it's going to take to do that. Maybe what it takes to do that is us suffering dramatically under, some serious draconian changes. If that's the only alternative, maybe there's an argument for why that should be what we go through. But it seems to me that we're in this position where right now most of us do believe that these are rights. It seems to me that, as you've pointed out, and I think you're correct, that the Constitution actually really does guarantee most of these things. So despite the discomfort at the fact that they may not have used the proper methodology to enact these things, the problem is we're stuck with right now. I don't see any way of passing any of these rights or guaranteeing any of these rights that are currently guaranteed, even if it's done through an inappropriate way. I don't see a way of doing that. I agree. I don't want to necessarily. I mean, I think you made a great argument. I believe in universal health care, but I think you made a spectacular argument for why the way Obama did it was really should not have been prohibited. Should not have been permitted. And I think you had a really good point there. But we are stuck with. I don't see how we get to fixing Congress enough that they'll be able to deal with that problem. And if we do, it's going to take so long that the amount of suffering while, these rights languish in, non-existence, it seems to me, I mean, we've got the problem now. The ideal or the, the principal way of doing it, perhaps going forward, we should be a lot more careful. That I agree, and perhaps maybe slowly roll these back when Congress is prepared. But we're doing it right now at a time that Congress is more deadlocked than any time in history. And not only do I not see it changing, I see these things now coming before Congress making the deadlock worse. I see by us making these decisions, even if legally they're correct, and if we can correct it so that we can pass these appropriately right now, adding to the problems already in Congress, I think it's going to make it worse. I think undoing this actually jeopardizes us more.
And this is where I get called a bastard. Because we did this to ourselves. It can't be the only. Well, is this really the only place you're called a bastard? I mean, come on. Well, yeah, no. Okay, this is. I'm just pointing out this is where people start calling me a bastard.
All right.
We did this to ourselves, and it sucks that these current generations are the ones that are suffering because of this. But we allowed these things to happen. The federal government was never intended to do the scope of things that it was doing. You also brought up the point that it's like, how are they supposed to have the time to legislate all of these things? If you're saying that the alphabet agencies can't enforce policy, that it has to be legislated by the legislature, which the Constitution says you can't abdicate the legislating of laws. What all alphabet agencies could do, and when they were originally put together to do, was to enact the individual policies to enforce a specific law passed by the Congress. That's what they were supposed to do. So, when they say, look, the EPA is going around and they're instituting a policy of moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Well, Congress never passed a law stating that this would be the law of the land. So, the EPA clearly has no authority to do that. If Congress passes a law saying we want to reduce, or it's going to be, law that nobody can emit more than so much CO2 in a year, and then they pass that law to the EPA, which is an enforcement agency. I don't think it should be, but it is. And that's what most of the alphabet agencies are, or enforcement agencies. They devise the policies and individual rules to affect that specific law. And then they can enforce those rules pursuant to that specific law. And the alphabet agencies are getting to the point. The ATF is guilty of this horribly. The EPA is guilty of this. SEC is guilty of this. Most of them are guilty of this, where there is no underlying law to which they are making policy to enforce. They're just making policies. And this even happens a tremendous amount in the FMCSA, which is ironic because that is one agency where the federal government absolutely has clear authority to regulate. That is interstate commerce. The Federal Motor Safety Carrier Association, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. That deals with the movement of goods between the states, interstate commerce.
Yeah.
And yet the FMCSA is still implementing large amounts of laws and regulations and rules that must be followed legally. They carry the weight of law behind them, where Congress hasn't actually legislated anything. And this is where you get into the quagmire of things. Congress was never intended to do all of these things. The states were intended to do all of these things, to keep it as local as possible because, things change between different groups of people. What works in Washington may not work in Virginia. So they recognized that, and they wanted the states to handle most of these things. And you're closer to your state government and have a more direct role in your own state's governments. And the state governments are much closer to the people which they are governing. Runs into the problem of what happens on the internet. The more anonymity, the farther away you get from the people, the less you have to directly face those people, the more nefarious you think you can get away with, more nefarious things think you can get away with. And this is a well-known phenomenon on the internet. I understand why people don't recognize it in government as well. So when you say, well, Congress doesn't have the time to be legislating all of these things. Well, maybe they should stop legislating a bunch of these things, return those things to the states to deal with, and reduce the size and cost of the government. I mean, this is another issue that I have that I take is the cost of the government. Government decides it's going to put in a new policy, they actually do pass a law, they actually get some program going, and people's taxes don't immediately go up to pay for it. They borrow the money, so it creates a very bad. I just forgot the term. What the hell is that?
Moral hazard.
Thank you. Creates a very bad and significant moral hazard. Well, just pass a law. Let's get this program informed. Well, the people aren't actually paying for any of these things. The government has borrowed the money. I mean, we're over $20 trillion in debt, and we're on schedule right now. I mean, it's come down because the pandemic really shot a big spike, a $3 trillion deficit in 1 year. Well, but we're still averaging $1 trillion a year. It's like, look, these have real economic consequences. If we don't change what we're doing economically, there will be an economic collapse or serious depression, economic depression in the United States. This is unsustainable, and we're allowing it to happen. I don't understand why more people, I guess civics is just, and governmental policy and politics is an anathema to the majority of Americans, because it's harder than hell to get half of the population to vote in a national election. So we're doing this to ourselves. We're losing the reasons behind why things were set up the way that they were. We're getting lazy and abdicating our responsibilities, and now we're going to suffer for it. So yeah, people may start suffering, and I have a hard time with the notion that we probably shouldn't be suffering for these things, because we've screwed a hell of a lot of things up. Somebody has to pay the piper at some time, and people scream from the rooftop, look, especially the younger generations, look, we didn't have any control over this. It's not our fault. Yeah, you're right. You got screwed by previous generations that abdicated their responsibility, and now you're paying for it. Learn the lesson and learn it well, and make sure that you teach your children how important it is to make sure that your governments are doing things for principled reasons, making sure that they're doing things the way that they should be done. So that we don't run into these problems again, because it's like, because of consequentialist arguments, we're going, well, now we have to kind of just throw away the rule of law to get these things done, or people are going to suffer. And it's like, I understand. I don't want people to suffer either. I don't see a way out of the suffering. It's coming because we aren't doing the things that need to be done.
All right, so what I'm going to do, we have a super chat, so and then I want to mention, so we are, it's an open hang. Anyone who wants to come in, the link is pinned at the top. It's also in the description. It's the same link we always use, so come on in. Anyone who wants to come in. We do expect balance on this show. We work very hard on that, so, you know, please be respectful and realize if you want to come in to, you know, either say why I'm right or say why 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 is wrong. We are delighted to have you come in and, oh, come on, that was fucking funny. All right. So I've told that joke more than once, but still. So we hope you'll come on in. We have a $2 super chat, Sinister Porpoise, Ayn Rand's ethical egoism sucks. Listen, I love the, I absolutely love the simplicity of it. You know, I think that's one of the things I really liked about it. And it very much in the same way that I love socialism, and I like a lot of these. Now, Marxism is, you know, it's deceptive in deceptively simple, but I think nonetheless a lot of these ideals. But yeah, they don't work, and there's any number of reasons why they don't work. We do have. Oh, we had someone for a second, but then we lost them. Oh, and they're back. So let me. What I'm going to do is we'll get Greg in here, and but before, so Greg's here, and let me. Oh, for whatever reason, Greg isn't up on the monitor there. So, there you go. Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So I do want to hear from Greg. I want to say one just quick thing. Let's make sure that we get so that just whoever is there. We go. The active speaker should be in the main window, but you know I don't see on there. I wonder why not. All right. So Greg, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
My pleasure. All right, so
yeah,
there we go. So it's just laggy. Don't know why. All right. Okay. So my thinking is I think you're right, and I think moral hazard is a concept that is not well understood. I think it's something that we. It's the same thing. I mean, you want to create monsters in children, give them everything they want, and teach them that, you know, there's not, and we have the ability to do that now. I mean, we're such a rich country, you know, you can sit there and give your kids anything they want. You can make them live consequence-free lives for the most part, and they are the worst sociopathic human beings you can fathom. So I agree that we have insulated ourselves, and that's what the internet is, you know, you can say and do just about anything you want reasonably free of consequence, and look what happens. So I agree with that. I just think that we can correct the problem with a better eye towards the future, and B, a slower. I'm for Roberts. I'm for the, you know, the incremental approach of rolling this back. And yeah, you know, my concern is that things are already so dysfunctional. This is going to add to the dysfunction, not repair it.
That may be the correct approach. I mean, I'm not saying that this all needs to change tomorrow. It may be that the best approach is the incremental approach, because, you know, consequences do matter, and I don't like seeing people suffer either. You know, but the only thing I can say is we've kind of done this to ourselves. I hate to say it that way because, you know, I didn't make all of these choices. These are a culmination of choices over the past 100 years or so. You know, and it's like I'm not entirely sure why the amending the Constitution has fallen so out of favor. It's like, you know, I think the Second Amendment should have already been amended. It should have been amended after World War I, probably, and definitely after World War II. It should have been amended. You know, I mean, there's several amendments that should have been done, and you know, anyway, it's an incredibly difficult problem. We've made things so complicated. You know, everything is so intertwined and interconnected, especially when it comes to federal authority. How do you unwind some of that stuff? You know, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, we've got ourselves in a pretty big pickle, and we're seeing a hell of a lot of problems because of it.
Oh, okay. So let's pick up on that. Yeah, I want to get Greg. So I want to before we have Greg speak, Michael Westby. Greg is way too photogenic. Completely agree. That's why his camera is off. Is because I don't like competing with that kind of. So no, he's not going to be permitted to. We're going to put the shield down on that. So Greg, please, what were you going to say?
I totally agree. I think that we have stopped doing constitutional amendments in this country. I don't know why people. I think it's adding to our political stagnation that it feels like we're constantly having to redo these things. So I'm interested, though. I know I saw you guys do the EPA kind of like on a video, and I guess is that what you guys were just talking about?
Yes.
Okay. So is the idea that so you guys do agree that there should have been some type of like legislation that was passed through Congress in order to specifically target CO2?
Well, I think Xander and I each have a different view on it. Big shocker, but we agree. I think we agree with the principles. I think we disagree with how to maybe implement them. But that notwithstanding, it's not just the EPA. It's basically everything that SCOTUS has been doing. Is what we've been sort of talking about. But for the EPA, in my view, the EPA really got its authority from Congress. If Congress doesn't like what they're doing or how they're doing it, Congress can revoke it. But it's Congress's job to provide oversight for the EPA, and the EPA was functioning reasonably within how Congress was happy with it. The Supreme Court is saying, no, Congress really cannot have the EPA running around like that. The EPA is not empowered to do that and cannot be empowered by Congress, and has therefore removed it. And in each case, you're not even addressing whether or not we should have those standards, just whether or not they should be implemented by Congress or by the EPA. And then we'll eventually get, could Congress even do that, is going to be the next step. But I think roughly that's where the disagreement lies. If that makes sense.
We're not disputing or arguing over what the policies actually are. We're disputing over where the authority is derived to do these things. For example, the Constitution is pretty clear, that the powers of the federal government are limited and enumerated, and nowhere in the Constitution does it enumerate a power under Congress to regulate anything to do with the environment. Ergo, it specifically says if the power isn't directly delegated to the Constitution or prohibited to the state, then the power is specifically prohibited to the U.S. government and reserved for the state or the people respectively. So, Congress doesn't even have the authority constitutionally, as far as I can read of the Constitution. Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate any environmental issues whatsoever, and they've empowered an alphabet agency. That alphabet agency isn't acting upon duly passed legislation and is creating out of whole cloth policies, procedures, and future plans, i.e. moving the country away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy without any kind of legislation passed. So it's like we're not arguing over whether this stuff should be done. We're arguing whether there's actual authority there to do it. My contention is that Congress didn't even have the authority to make the EPA to begin with. It certainly doesn't have the authority to pass any laws about it, and that we need, because I believe that environmental issues are a global, not just countrywide, but global threat, and we shouldn't expect single states to be trying to address these problems. That this is, in fact, an area that should fall under federal government authority, and that we should amend the Constitution to grant Congress the authority explicitly to make regulation and policy in regards to environmental protection. And that the fact that we haven't done that and just let them violate the Constitution to do all of these things, and now the Supreme Court is clawing back a lot of those delegated powers that Congress really didn't have the authority to delegate in the first place. So that's kind of where we're kind of disagreeing on, is whether or not there's actual authority to do this, and what is the best way forward. I say pass a constitutional amendment because I think that the argument for federal authority over environmental policy is warranted, but that it requires a constitutional amendment to grant Congress the authority to legislate. So, and then the alphabet agencies, since they're unelected bureaucrats, can only come up with policy to enforce very specific laws passed by the Congress. And they're not doing that. They're going way above their scope.
All right, so let's please.
So I'm interested in why you think that Congress, even with an explicit legislation in order to curb air pollution, like why wouldn't that be a part of their enumerated constitutional powers?
because the Constitution doesn't say anything about environmental protection whatsoever, or granting the authority to regulate businesses in that way.
It does say health, though, right? It does. Health is health issues are in fact included. I think. I'm trying to remember. I'll look that up in a second. Were you gonna say something, Greg? I'll look it up while you.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, that's like okay. I mean, I thought that it would be, at least in some aspect of like federal ability to regulate like some type of pollution, that it would have to be like in there.
Well, it's not. The founding fathers hadn't thought of it. But yeah.
Well, I mean, it's the Ninth Amendment, right? The Ninth. It's even though it's not explicitly enumerated. I mean, it's hard to imagine that the Constitution doesn't allow the legislation to stop something that would pollution that would kill everyone in the United States, right? I mean, it's kind of obvious that there would have to be some type of like ability to stop that from happening.
Yeah, to that extreme, like say. Regulation of nuclear waste so that it's not just lying around killing hundreds of people. There's a good argument to be made that, hey, people have the rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that the federal government that is there specifically to protect the rights of the individuals. Something like that would grossly violate the rights of the individuals. Federal government has the authority to step in and regulate that and to stop that from occurring mass death. It could also be seen as a national security issue. If you kill all of the residents of the country, well, there's nobody there to defend the country or to run the economy. The country ceases to exist. So there are certainly some areas where, I think that we could make very clear delineations to authority of Congress to act on these issues. The Ninth Amendment specifically applies to citizens, not to the governments. It's, as a matter of fact, it's an injunction against governments removing rights from the citizen.
But the 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment though does say that the federal government can enact laws for public safety and for relating to public health. So. Would that not fall under then the 10th Amendment, saying that, listen, if the environment goes completely to shit, that in fact the legislator, the U.S. legislative, let me just say Congress, that Congress does in fact have that power under the 10th Amendment.
No, Congress doesn't have that power under the 10th Amendment at all, because I think you're misunderstanding what the 10th Amendment is. 10th Amendment is the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the state, or prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or the people. It doesn't say that has nothing to do with public health. I may have confused that. Let me see if I can find the exact. I take your point. To provide for the general welfare of the citizens. I mean, that's in the Constitution itself. That's not even an amendment. That's the General Welfare Clause that's grossly abused. That and the Interstate Commerce Clause. But those two clauses in the Constitution setting up congressional authority are grossly abused. The founders thought that we would maintain at least some intelligence in our review of these things, and perhaps didn't take enough time to actually define things. I mean, there's a reason legalese is written the way it is today, because so many people find ways to wiggle their way around what was clearly intended, because you didn't, enumerate things closely enough. But after 250, 240 years, word usage changes as well. This is one of the reasons why I'm very much an originalist interpretator when it comes to law. The law means what it says when it was written, not what usages might have changed in the interim time. This is why I think that the Constitution could have been amended several times to grant Congress the authority, because I agree that there are, like environmental issues. I agree that should be under federal policy. I mean, I agree with you. I may not necessarily always agree with the things that the EPA does, but I agree that we should probably have, congressional oversight, congressional control over these things. When it comes to SEC and dealing with international banks or nationwide banks, it's like there is an argument for interstate commerce, that is a legitimate argument because the banks are now nationalized, or not nationalized. They're national, banks across state lines. You're banking across state lines. But it's like we should be doing this the right way. And if we can't get it done the right way, then we need to reevaluate whether there's actually support for it or if things are just being gummed up. And unfortunately, we have gotten so convoluted. The government does so many things, has become so complicated that there is no easy fix for this. And even though that this is my stated preference to go back to, the size and scope and role that government was initially, federal government, was initially intended to be, I'm not entirely convinced that that's an actual solution to our long-term problems because, we had a limited federal government once and it led us here. So I'm not sure that clawing back all of this stuff is actually going to help us in the long run.
So, okay.
How do you feel about the EPA, as I understand it, in order to do 111D and all the things that they do under that that's in this West Virginia versus EPA case? I mean, they seem to establish the framework and then allow the states to kind of figure it out by themselves, like how they interpret or enact or figure out the regulatory body kind of by themselves. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that you could do it that way. Say, hey, look, this is the framework that we think is really good. The EPA should be populated by, environmental experts instead of bureaucrats. And unfortunately, a lot of these, I'm not saying there aren't experts in the EPA, but there's a huge number of bureaucrats that are making decisions as well. And, these alphabet agencies should really be comprised of the experts to come up with the best policies for moving forward. But saying, hey, here's our framework, these are our goals, this is what we're trying to accomplish, give it to the states to pass whatever laws the states need to pass to accomplish those things would be great until you have a state that says, yeah, I don't buy what you're brewing here. This Kool-Aid just looks a little too tart. And then what do you do? There does, if you're going to get serious about environmental protection, which I think we should, you're going to need the full weight of the federal government behind it in order to enforce the laws. So that's why I think that a constitutional amendment is needed to grant Congress the authority to regulate environmental impacts by business and in some cases individuals. But I think giving a framework saying, hey, you guys figure out how you're going to, what laws you need to pass to meet these specific goals and framework that we've laid out. I think that's a great idea as long as the states comply and do it. But what happens when Wyoming says, screw off, we like our coal plants. There happens to be several coal power plants in Wyoming. And it's like, and we're not shutting them down. And so the EPA is like, well, we eliminate coal, so why shouldn't, what do you do then when a state says, yeah, I'm not jiving with any of this?
So Greg, what are your thoughts on the Supreme Court decision on the EPA?
Yeah, I listened to the oral argument and then I read the decision today, and it's just really frustrating, I guess, as a scientist, looking at, there's a lot of different ways that we are impacting the environment negatively, and it's not just pollution. And it just seems frustrating that it seems to deal with explicitly this idea of the clean power plan that it originally had, and then the EPA kind of figuring out that they on themselves, they're like, oh, we don't actually have that regulatory power, so then they replaced it with the Affordable Clean Energy ACE. And then this is kind of the whole point of the whole point of the lawsuits. And it seems like Roberts, especially in the oral arguments and stuff, he's just kind of throwing it back in their face, saying that these major questions doctrine, it doesn't fall under that. You're right in the beginning. You didn't have any regulatory ability, and you don't have any regulatory ability here. So I guess I can I can kind of understand that, but at the same time, it's odd for me to think that if the EPA exists and the Clean Water Act exists, that we are and those are legal and allowed to happen. It seems odd to me that the emissions. It seems very very tailored into the exact process of the energy turnover, where it's like, okay, we're going to make coal into energy. It seems very narrow-sighted of me to think that like there also wouldn't have any implications on the beginning part, where it's like now it's the mining and how we're obtaining those materials, and then afterwards too, where it's an emissions thing, and that's kind of like where this whole the ACE section comes from, because now it's like, okay, yeah, we're clarifying that CO2 is now a pollutant, and I think Sandring, you're right in that it's not explicitly stated in the quote unquote like pollutants that even the EPA recognizes itself. So it just seems odd to me that the before and after they wouldn't have any regulatory control, but during they do.
Yeah, I don't like the way that any of this. This isn't the way this works. This is the way that any of this works, or at least it's not supposed to work this way. But because it's worked this way for the past almost 100 years, this is just. I mean, it's just slowly slid into this quagmire of a mess. And I think that the justices on the Supreme Court are trying to go back to a more actual originalist look at the Constitution as to what authority do people or do these organizations actually have, and they're going, well, there actually isn't any authority for any of this stuff. And of course that Nick does have a point that these things have consequences, and that how do you unwind nearly a century's worth of progress to a specific point? It's like things have become so complicated that you want to try and affect one thing. Well, you're going to. I'm being attacked by a giant moth. Holy crap! How that are going to affect like 20 other things as well. So and again people are really mad that Roe versus Wade was overturned, yet it was founded on very shaky reasoning. And when you start doing this stuff like with what the EPA is doing, it's done off of shaky authority, and you're going to end up with this court or that court's going to overturn this or that. It's like the best policy to going forward is to explicitly grant authority for the federal government to be doing this stuff. And then we aren't going to have the Supreme Court saying, hey, you actually can't do this. You don't have the regulatory power in these areas. And the courts tend to stop at the first thing to disprove the argument. So even though you might have 5 different arguments about something, the very first time they come to one that conclusively settles the issue, they stop there. So you don't get an answer for the other 4 things, and you have to wait for another court case to rise that deals with one of those other 4 issues to rise before. Like you're saying, well, they have authority during the conversion, but they don't have it before or after. That seems awfully weird, and that's probably because there hasn't been a case specifically coming up dealing with it before and after. I could be incorrect on that. I don't have a lot of time to read, and I didn't have a lot of. I spent all day driving today, and as soon as I stopped, I got sucked into a President Sunday debate, and then so I've not had time to really sit down and dig into all of these things. My big thing was when Nick did the overtime and some of the things that he was talking about, where I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to disagree with you here. And it's kind of sad because it ends about a 3-month-long stint where we were pretty much agreeing with each other over everything.
Disgusting.
And now suddenly the Supreme Court comes out and actually upholds the constitutional authority or lack of constitutional authority of the EPA to enforce rules, especially that haven't been legislated by Congress. And and I'm like, okay, well, I have thoughts on this, and so I was like, oh, well, I do want to get your thoughts on these kinds of things, and but he didn't have time earlier, so we're doing it now. So now I'm like jamming a whole bunch of stuff into like one little show where it's like going all over the place, and there's too many things to cover.
Let me say two quick things before you answer. Yeah, so we were talking, and I was telling him, look, it's like we should have these rights. These rights are part of it and part of the system, and we already have them. And his reply was,
Force. That's not how the Force works.
so I'm not going to get addicted to those soundboards because those are really frustrating. But nonetheless, also the Sunday debate, I really wanted to catch, and it was just a nightmare getting ready just for this show, so I missed it. But I will, if Titan happens to have it handy, great. If not, I'll be dropping a link to that debate because it's on a topic that's very important to me, which is, does cancel culture work? Should you do it? What are the bounds? When is it appropriate? Does it backfire? All that. It's a great topic and one that we've been interested in on In Time. Anyways, I'm sorry, Greg. So please continue.
Yeah, it's just like this idea that like there has to be a specific toxic pollutant that's in the legislation in order for it to come up. They talk about this a lot in the Roberts decision and in oral arguments, and it's kind of weird to me because it's like, in science, like what if we discovered a new pollutant that did a bunch more damage than we previously thought, and now we need to curtail this? Or like, for example, does CO2, are we talking about carbon-12 or are we talking about carbon-13? Because they are different. So would we have to pass legislation that somehow would CO2 encompass all of the different types of stuff, all the different carbon dioxide? And on top of that, it's kind of, there's other paths and ways of getting to carbon dioxide too. So it's like you could just burn wastes that created CO2 as an emission. Is that like, where is that in this whole thing too now? It's just, it doesn't make, I just hate this idea that it has to be explicitly stated. It makes me feel like as a scientist where every time we pass or publish something, does it need to be passed through legislation now too, to say that this is real, that we accept this, that this is something that's a part of the idea of what the EPA should cover? It just seems very arbitrary, because right now the EPA is kind of, it's grounded in research science, right? That's where it's kind of like getting where it needs to go and what it needs to do, rather than having to get the okay from the legislation in order to know whether or not the science is settled. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's like, things can be changing, and it's like every time you come out with something, science comes out with something and says, hey, we've kind of found this, we've observed this, and it's like, yeah, but the legislation hasn't, Congress hasn't passed legislation authorizing us to have anything to do with this, so we need to pass more legislation. And it seems like it's very cumbersome. Instead of empowering the EPA to say, look, this is, we're getting our information from science, we're deriving policy from, the most current science that we have, which would include any of these new things and would, include to at least what a scientist would be common sense things like, we're talking about carbon dioxide. Well, we mean all of them, instead of having to label each and every what is the term for the differentiation between them? I'm forgetting. Yes, between the different isotopes. I swear I listened to a book on chemistry once, and there might have even been a chemistry class in high school. I can't really remember that far back, but so yeah, but this is one of the reasons why I think that we should pass a constitutional amendment that authorizes Congress to empower the EPA to do those kinds of things. That is the simplest solution. Maybe not the easiest one. Nick has pointed out that we've had difficulty, especially in the last 80 years, passing a constitutional amendment. And it's like we have the American people have the ability to do this if it's important enough to them, and that's kind of where we run into. It's like trying to get people just to go out and vote at all. It's like less than half the people are voting. So it's like, how are you going, clearly half the country or half the population couldn't be bothered enough with political policy to actually go and vote, to inform themselves in any way, shape, or form about any of the issues that they care about, and finding the candidates that best represent their, and of course, again, there's a lot of other issues tied into that as well. that problems have been built upon problems, and that it's like you want to solve this problem, but there's like 3 other problems that you have to solve in order to make the solution to this problem tenable. So things get really difficult, really bad, and it's like we need to make things a little more simple. The people need to, the population of the United States as a whole needs to become a little bit more aware of the things that are going on, the issues that are happening, and get more politically involved, and making their voices heard. People who say these are pressing issues that need to be solved, and here's how we solve them. Unfortunately,
I agree. I would love. I think people need to get more involved in the democratic process. I totally agree with you there. For what it's worth, Roberts in his decision does disagree with you, or I don't know if he does. I'm curious about your thoughts here. Is on page 19 for those reading along. Quote, thus in certain extraordinary cases, both separation of power principles and a practical understanding of legislative intent make us, quote, reluctant to read into ambiguous statutory text, end quote. The delegation claimed to be lurking here. This is my emphasis. To convince us otherwise, something more than a merely plausible textual basis for the agency action is necessary. The agency instead must point to, quote, clear congressional authorization, end quote, for the power it claims. So I'm curious, is Roberts there saying that it needs to be a congressional bill, or is he talking about a legislative, like an actual amendment? It seems like he's talking about a bill that needs to be passed in Congress.
Correct. The way that it has to be done now, or in this particular case, he's like, look, Congress has to grant you the authority. So you need to have a congressional bill passed that grants you the specific authority to do these things. And that if you move outside of the scope of the specific congressional authority that does exist, you lose any authority to do anything because you haven't been granted that authority. That is one of the reasons why I'm like, no, we should pass a constitutional amendment. Besides the argument that can be made that Congress doesn't even have the authority to pass any legislation dealing with, with environmental concerns because they weren't ever granted that right. And if you're not explicitly granted authority to do something, then it is forbidden to you. When it comes to the federal government. So
that's why I find this.
That's why I'm like.
Well, that's why I find this so disingenuous, is because it's like, yes, he wants them to pass the bill so that can come up before the Supreme Court and he can shoot that down too.
Which would push people in, would essentially say that the only path forward to solve this problem, because we kind of most of the country agrees that this is a problem, is to pass the constitutional amendment. And passing the amendment would allow for the kinds of responsive EPA that you would like to see, where we don't have to pass a bill every single time a new potentially harmful gas is found to grant the EPA authority to make policy regarding it.
But he's adding that extra step.
That's kind of what we have to.
He's adding an extra step that he knows he's going to shoot down. He knows that in his view, they don't have the right to do that anyway. So he's saying, well, they have to do it. It's on the legislative branch. And I think he's just virtue signaling. It's the same thing, too, when he says, well, we're abdicating what...
Very well could be.
Yeah, we're abdicating what we as judges have been doing. We as judges have been doing the legislating, and we're abdicating that. And I was like, yeah, I think there is a tenable argument for that position, but I don't think that's a black and white position. And I just think there's
nothing's black and white. People have multiple motivations for the things that they do.
I mean, I think that the 1970 bill that actually created the EPA. So this is before the part of the Clean Air Act that which is the 111D, which is kind of like the whole point of the whole lawsuit. But this is the original text that created it in 1970. Quote, the office shall be responsible for the conduct of programs for the definition, prevention, and control of air pollution, having as their objectives, 1, the definition of air quality required to minimize or eliminate deleterious effects of air pollutants, and 2, the achievement of a wholesome air environment through development of air pollution control technology. I don't understand how CO2 and emissions is not already involved there. It seems like the definition of air quality, that's their establishing that, and then 2, the achievement of a wholesome air environment, through the development of air pollution control technology. So those are scrubbers, those are emissions reductions, that kind of thing. It seems it,
Right,
and then on top of that, go ahead.
I believe that one of his again, I haven't had time to really sit down and read everything that's in this, so I'm going off of what a bunch of other people have said, and which probably isn't a particularly wise thing to do, because I'll end up sticking my foot in my mouth at some point if I haven't already. But they're making the point that the Congress doesn't have the ability to delegate that much power. So even though the act founding the EPA says, well, they should be able to do all of these things, one of the arguments against that is they actually don't have the authority to delegate that much power to the EPA. They can't do that. That is something that is held specifically to the legislature and can only be exercised by the legislature. They can't delegate that authority.
In the conclusion, I think, which is a pretty good synopsis of his. Sorry, I'm just reading a lot of the decision, if that's okay.
Please.
Primary sources.
Do that, because
okay, cool.
We actually need the decision read here. So.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I love primary sources. So I'm actually on a big oral arguments SCOTUS kick, where I'm just like, you guys know that they actually just put that up online, right? You guys, I listen to it all the time now. It's pretty fun. Anyway, so this is the final conclusion, and I think it's a pretty good summary of this Roberts majority decision here. So, quote, capping carbon dioxide emissions at a level that will force a nationwide transition away from the use of coal to generate electricity may be sensible, quote, solution to the crisis of the day, end quote. But it's not plausible that Congress gave EPA the authority to adopt on its own such a regulatory scheme in Section 111D. A decision of such magnitude and consequence rests with Congress itself or an agency acting pursuant to a clear delegation from the representative body. The judgment of the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia is reversed, and the case are remanded for the proceedings consistent with the opinion. So I think that's pretty much what you're saying, Sandrine. It's it needs its own. A decision of such a magnitude and consequence rests with Congress itself. They're not specifically saying it has to be a constitutional amendment, which I think is interesting.
Well, that's what concerns me.
They're not saying that.
They believe that, but they're not saying
that
it
right now. Right, they're not saying that right now because they didn't get that far. Mm-hmm. So now the next case that comes up where Congress says, okay, fine, we're going to specifically legislate and give them very specific legislative authority to do these specific things. Then it's going to be brought into the court. Somebody's going to sue them again. Ends up back at the Supreme Court, assuming it gets that far. And then they're going to come out, and this is the concern that Nick has. They're going to say, well, Congress doesn't have any authority to be regulating any of this stuff anyway, so we're going to overturn all this stuff. And that's what at which point you would have to have a constitutional amendment. That's the only way forward at that point, or wait for a future court to decide, hey, we're going to allow a more liberal interpretation here and let them do it again and overturn this decision. So
and let me quickly dovetail this with where they had a legit point with the SEC. So one of the problems was that the SEC, and this was the problem they highlighted. Now, this is what they've been doing, which is what really irks me, which is they've been, in my view, talking out of both sides of their mouth. They did this with the SEC. They certainly did this, in my view, with the Casey decision. But the argument was, look, the SEC is, and this argument was like a couple of paragraphs, and then the rest was on the groundwork for overthrowing the authority of EPA and all the others. But for what they said was unique about the SEC was that it had its own judges, it had its own enforcement abilities. So what would happen is if you violated SEC regulations, you could go to jail, even though they weren't a part of, the what is it? The code of the legal code of the United States, you violated a regulatory commissions, and you could only appeal to the SEC. You couldn't appeal through the regular court system because you hadn't even been convicted of a crime in that. Now, there has to be exceptions because people are brought on by the SEC, so I'd have to go back and look at it. But that was essentially that they have their own justice system, their own judges, their own laws, and there's really no way to appeal it. And that made a lot of sense to me. I was like, okay, that's a serious problem. So that's what made the SEC unique and why their decision on the SEC could not be applied to such, like the EPA and so on and so forth. But then they gave pages upon pages upon pages of why all of those agencies have to be curtailed. And then they applied that exact same reasoning to the EPA, which is it's not just whether or not they have enforcement powers, which the EPA does have, but it's also whether or not they are acting within the most narrow defined scope of powers, such that you can guarantee they are not legislating. So there's almost no difference in this view between a legislation and regulation. They're the same thing, essentially, to this court that I can tell. And I agree that the EPA should not be making laws. I agree that they, at least the SEC, had no higher authority. The SEC, you have to have. 2008 is a great example, and I think it's an existential threat to not be properly regulating these things, but it's all of a sudden a lot harder. As I think you were going to say something, Greg, and then I'm sure Xandring wants to tell me why I'm wrong.
I feel like it is narrow, though. I mean, that's what's crazy. I feel like they aren't overstepping like what Congress is allowing them here, I guess. I mean, especially considering, I mean, the whole point of this was to reduce coal-fired electricity generation from 38% to 27% over 16 years. I mean, and on top of that, they're establishing a cap and trade system where, coal-fired power plants that were deficient are allowed to trade their credits back and forth to better ones. You know, it seems like if this was like the moderate position and the incremental approach to this thing, they could have said 0%, right? They could have said no coal-fired power plants and put them out of business. But the whole point that these power plants are making, especially in the oral arguments, is that it's so like financially onerous on us that there's no way that we can possibly pay for this. So, which I think it's just ridiculous. I mean, they're talking about billions of dollars that's going to be needed to invest into these old power plants. But I mean, the United States electricity industry, and during this time, I mean, we're talking about $387 billion a year, and they're complaining about a couple $1 billion. It just doesn't seem like it's that onerous.
Well, and then what happens when we make a treaty that says we as a country will cap our emissions to a certain level, and the other countries abide by their end of the treaty? We expect them to, but now we've got a problem, which is without passing some form of constitutional amendment that either explicitly follows that treaty or more generally empowers either Congress or somebody else to act on that treaty. It seems to me, Xandring's made a point, and he's absolutely correct on this. It's one that, as a history teacher, is very hard to explain to people. But the process was deliberately designed to slow things down. It was deliberately designed to slow things down for any number of reasons, but in the largest sense, so that we wouldn't make rapid changes that would then have to be unmade. That would be a very, very deliberative process. But it just seems to me that it makes it so slow that we will not be able to function in a global economy anymore, and I think that would be very detrimental to us.
Well, Paris is non-binding, right? I mean, we just the Paris Climate Accord, which you're talking about. They are. And we're actually, and actually, because coal is so inefficient and so expensive, and the expansion of horizontal fracking across the United States, like we were actually hitting the numbers 10 years in advance of those numbers. So it's like it wasn't even a federal requirement that actually did that. So it just seems like a lot of states are purposefully dragging their heels So if you go to compared to California, which is, I mean, let's just be honest, it's a first world nation basically operating as a state. Okay, California has 63% of carbon-free electricity sources. So that's renewables, hydro, and nuclear, right? All together. The United States entirely, all together, with California included, 19%. So it seems like there are states that are purposefully dragging their heels in regards to making this transition, and the Roberts majority decisions basically saying like, oh, the EPA is causing all of this change to happen, and it's not fair, and it's like, it seems like the entire world is going in this direction, and it's just specific states in the United States specifically that are dragging their heels.
I think you've got a good point, but I do want to and I'm just going to say this so we don't have to go into the entire thing again, but I think Ksandring, one of the things that Ksandring, when Ksandring first started talking about abortion, he is pro-choice, but believed that this decision, the conclusion had been reached basically by the wrong means. So the argument was faulty. He believed in the conclusion, just not the argument. So it's the fallacy. Mm-hmm. Just because somebody's got a bad argument doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means the argument's bad. And I think just to try to as quickly as possible, not encapsulate, but summarize the position. I think Ksandring seems to me, and he's going to correct me if I'm wrong. He'll probably correct me even if I'm right, to be quite honest. I think that his position is you're right about all of these arguments as to it's individual states who are screwing with the process, probably because it is cheaper, and screw the environment or screw other people. But the problem is the way the Constitution is written. Until we follow a very specific process, they are empowered to do that. And that in and of itself is a value, the value of those states being able to have the right to operate a certain way until there is a constitutional amendment, and there's a very deliberate reason for that. So
even Roberts disagrees with that, though. It doesn't need a constitutional amendment, and we have a democratic process where those states could actually undo the Clean Water Act. They could vote out the EPA. We have those mechanisms for them to have stopped this, but they're unable to convince people.
I will say this: I don't think Roberts disagrees with that. I think he made another argument, and the fact that I think Ksandring would agree with me that Roberts thinks it has to be a constitutional amendment. If you get both Ksandring and I believing in that, when we come at Roberts from both of us, is that fair, Ksandring?
Yes.
Yeah, Roberts does, I think, believe you need a constitutional amendment, but he didn't make that argument. Now, as Ksandring was suggesting, the reason he didn't make the argument is he didn't have to. He was erring on the shorter part, which is what they should have done was do this in legislation. I think that's disingenuous because he doesn't believe that's what they should have done. He knows that's not what they should have done, and that's what he's going to say when they bring it up. So that's not what he should have done. So he's actually lying, in my view, when he says that's what they should have done, because that's not his view. And that's not the argument. The argument is they weren't empowered to do it in the first place. But he's taking that extra step because I think he's trying his best not to telegraph just how far he wants to go with this, and that was what the concurrent opinion by Thomas did, which is, by the way, why I think it was Thomas's wife who leaked the original decision.
Interesting.
I think Thomas's wife, Ginny, leaked the Alito decision. I think she leaked it because she was trying to cement it and move progress forward, and because she was so giddy with anticipation of where it was coming. And I think Thomas just did the exact same thing when he did his concurrent. I have to believe Alito was like, you did not just telegraph which anybody who was paying attention already knew. But
sure.
Yeah. And Ksandring, any thoughts?
Too many thoughts jumbling around in my head. I mean, it's just, we find ourselves in a mess, and part of the mess is because the federal government is doing too many things. Part of the mess is because there's not enough engagement with the citizenry of the United States. They don't seem to care enough to find the time to go vote, or to find the time to. And I get it. People are dealing with problems, but there's plenty of people that I mean, this is kind of important. It's the future of our country. You should probably get involved in that, and or at least completely shut up. If if you're not going to bother the vote, you completely shut up about complaining about anything, because
if you're working,
you didn't offer any solutions.
If you're working at minimum wage and you try to take the day off, you can get fired for that. If you've got a child, there's a large swath of this population, I agree with you 100%, that are just like, oh, no, I can't vote because of X, Y, but there's also a lot that, for practical reasons, can't do it. We're one of the few countries that don't have it as a holiday. So I'm just going to point that out on that. I think there are legit complications that this country misses.
I can absolutely agree with that.
I just don't want you to be called a bastard again, is all I'm saying. I'm just trying to avoid that.
You're not gonna stop that, because there are too many people that are like, my views on the Constitution should be interpreted to mean what it meant when it was written, instead of what we want it to mean today, because of different things like word usages changing and things like that. And there's a great many of people that disagree with me on that. They're just like, no, it shouldn't be. Look at all of the bad consequences that might derive from that. It's like, well, we kind of dug ourselves into these holes, and we've allowed the collective we over the generations, not specifically our generations necessarily, that caused the problem, but we're going to suffer for it. And maybe that's suffering. I'm not saying that. I am not saying this is true. I'm saying that maybe this suffering is what is needed, is to get enough people motivated to be into our system to actually fix some of these problems, instead of, and not standing for gridlock, actually start moving the process along. And there's a good argument to be made that, the process may be a bit too onerous and maybe a bit too slow to be able to respond to, modern issues. And again, that should possibly be changed. There's definitely good arguments for many of these things, and I'm not necessarily against any of those things. I think that we should have a good discussion about how do we really solve this thing. The problem is that the problems generally are so complex and so intertwined with so many other problems that we've built ourselves quite a huge mess here, and it's going to be difficult finding a good solution moving forward that doesn't undermine, the rule of law. That is a very important thing for civilization to function.
Yeah, I mean,
on a societal level.
It is odd for me, like, Kagan has talked a lot in the oral arguments about, like, the energy markets and all that kind of stuff, and it's just like, dang, man. I mean, before fossil fuels, I mean, do you guys know where we were getting the majority of our oil from? This is kind of crazy.
I don't.
Whales.
Oh, I should have known that. Yeah.
The in order to fund the kerosene and stuff, in order to the lamps and all that kind of stuff, we were killing whales. So if there was some way that the whales became cheaper than fracking or anything else, and there's this crazy rush to eliminate all the whales in the entire world, it's just odd for me to think. I don't know. It's weird for me to think that the EPA wouldn't have any say in that, and being like, guys, like, let's, it's just odd to me. I don't know. I hate it. But Sandrine, I totally agree with you, man, in that, like, people forget that it's actually democracy that is the more radical political position. And it's very basal, elementary politics of just, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do, and you're going to believe what I tell you you're going to believe. And there's always this rush to authoritarianism whenever there's something wrong with democracy. And it's the time that something doesn't happen that you don't like to get more involved rather than less. The people that are saying, I'm never going to vote again because SCOTUS doesn't do something that I want. I mean, that's just not the answer, right? And there are municipal governments, states that you can have like a big impact on, and those are going to be more like, one, radical in your types of politics, and then two, they're going to be changing more often. So there's a lot of states that, for example, passed these anti-Roe legislation. So as soon as Roe was repealed, and abortion was banned. But a lot of these states are 50-50 right now on whether or not they accept abortion or not. And some of them even have blue governors. So I think that there actually is a possibility in a lot of these states coming forward that we could see some expansion of abortion rights. I don't see, the Roe going back for probably decades at this point, but it is possible. I feel like it is a reality. And interestingly enough, there are some Republican states that have a Republican governor, state house, and legislator that have not banned abortion, which is Alaska, because there's a constitutional amendment in place, and New Hampshire. And New Hampshire in '97, I think, voted down their abortion ban. So it goes to show you that, like Alaska, for example, like people did good work to put rights they felt like were needed into state constitutions, and now the Republicans have power there. They can't just roll it back just like that. It's California right now putting the reproductive rights on the ballot and codifying it into their state constitutions. So there is good work still being done.
So let me interrupt real quick. There was a question in the live chat about Shin versus Ramirez. We have not covered that yet. We've covered that in a previous show, and there was an element of nuance that we had talked about, and now I'm kind of forgetting what it is, and I'm starting to fade a bit. So I don't know if anyone else wanted to discuss that while we're here. That is the one where if your attorney did not bring potentially exculpatory evidence during the trial, did not bring that out, so there was a failure of your attorney, do you have the right to an appeal? And the decision, if I recall, and I'm trying to remember this nuanced position, had something to do with they're not actually per se denying the right to an appeal. They're denying the right to an appeal at a federal level, and saying you can still appeal it in the state if the state lets you, but the state doesn't necessarily have to let you either. So there was nuance to the decision, but I don't remember it well enough right now. I've got too many in my head, so I don't know if anyone else has anything they wanted to say on that.
Is this the Miranda
that's one that I...
No.
No,
we covered it. I don't even remember.
Shin versus Ramirez, where they're saying you don't have the ability to, or you don't have the right to make a federal appeal based off of incompetent defense.
Legal. And it's roughly the same argument. There are definitely different. So it's not the same argument. It's not actually, that was poorly spoken. It's not the same argument. It's the same ideology, which is it's left to the state. If the state wants to accept an appeal based on that, fine. But you do not have a right to a federal appeal because your state screwed it up, essentially, because your state is not allowing you to appeal because you've been convicted, even though there's no, it's like, no, that's up to your state. That's your state administering the justice, not the federal government. It is not their job to be a source of appeal just because you don't like the fact that your state isn't letting you present new evidence, is essentially the argument, if I recall it correctly.
Yeah, and I want to go through and actually read that one, because that one's going to be, you're going to have to take a very close look at it and make sure that you get the elements correct on it to find out what exactly is being said. And most criminal laws state anyway. I mean, like murder is the states are the ones that prosecute murder charges. So it's just, it can be, yeah. That's one that I'm going, on the surface, it seems like a really, really bad thing and was decided incorrectly, but I don't know what the actual arguments being made are, and I want to read that one and get more information.
Well, so let me, and I think we're going to start wrapping up. I want to hear from everybody before we bail, but I did want to point out too that it's part of my concern about how quickly this is being done. If all of these mistakes were made over so long, and if we've already talked about the importance of government moving reasonably slowly, I think you have to roll these back slowly, if for no other reason than I think we're closer to a revolution than we've ever been. And I don't think poking the bear is necessarily a great idea. If Miranda Gideon, Loving, maybe even, again, because this was the point that I made, and this is one of the reasons I'm so triggered, is the arguments that they're using applies to the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision was decided correctly based on the logic that I'm seeing, unless I've missed something, and I've gone over both of the arguments. So if we're rolling all the way back, not because you don't have those rights, but because they had been decided, the method by which they were decided was inappropriate, the problem is we've now got the idea that because it's the legislators in the state that determine how the election is done, again, a very narrow interpretation that's being thrown at this court, and this court has said they're going to look at is, well, gee, doesn't that mean then that they decide? There's no oversight from judges. There's no oversight from the governor. It's up to them. And if you don't like how they did it, then vote somebody else into office. The problem is if they control the elections, which is explicitly why the federal government doesn't control the election for president, you may not be able to do that. That's why gerrymandering has to be able to be brought to the Supreme Court. But it looks to me like what this court is going to do is say, no, gerrymandering is a state's issue. If you think it's gerrymandered and you think gerrymandering is morally wrong, your state needs to fix it. The problem is there's absolutely no way to do that without the protection of the Supreme Court. You can't do that because they can just gerrymander your vote out of existence. So there is so much abdication of the federal government so rapidly on so many rights. If they actually do overturn Gideon, if they overturn if they decide that they will not in the future hear gerrymandering or any cases that have to do, and we don't know how they're going to answer that. I can't predict. I can predict how they're going to answer on a lot of these coming cases. I don't know how they're going to predict on that one. So it's unfair to say they will do it. But I think it's unfair to say, too, that it's not a distinct possibility that they'll do it. How does this country recover? It's gone too far, too quickly by that point, and I don't know, if at that point I don't even really have the right to vote anymore, because my state gets to determine how I vote. It even gets to determine who I vote for. I think we're done. And I think we're headed in that direction awfully quickly. And I could try to say that my rights were infringed upon. But if Gideon is gone, how am I going to do that unless I've got $1 million?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, Breyer and the Dobbs dissent writes, he's quoting his book, The Breaking the Promise of Brown, the Resegregation of America's Schools, quote, "It is not often in the law that so few have so quickly changed so much."
I think it's dangerous to go this quickly. I think it's going to yield unprecedented, unpredictable results. And if the goal is that the results are, you say, wow, this is really terrible, we need to overhaul Congress, and you vote for a new congressman, then maybe it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. I think it is going to have some of that impact, but I think the impact is going to be a lot more sideways and in a lot of other directions that I think the government was explicitly not supposed to work that fast, even if you're correcting mistakes.
I mean, this is what Roberts talks about in his concurrence in Dobbs. He's like, wow, this is crazy that they're talking about Roe and Casey. About Heller. Sorry, got the cases. In real law. But yeah, I mean, the fact that it's everything is so sweeping and so big and so and it's the first cases that this new majority sees, and the first case out of the start are these huge cases and these huge game-breaking precedents that are overhauled, and it's just it's crazy. I mean, we really have to think why so quickly, and why these cases, and why so sweeping.
Hold on a sec.
You've got a very good point. Oh.
No,
you've got a very good point about the founders specifically set things up to run fairly slowly, so that you didn't get swept up into a populist movement. The reverse could hold true as well. I mean, you wanted these things to be done slowly, so that you don't have overwhelming change so fast that it just tears the system apart. the reverse would also be true. I mean, that's an incredibly good point. Even if you're trying to fix problems, moving so fast with overwhelming changes, risk carrying everything apart. It's like, so, you have to be measured in the things that you do. You need to be measured in the, when you're legislating things, and you need to, and if mistakes are made, because mistakes will be made that need to be corrected. But even if you're trying to fix the mistakes, you still, you don't want to overwhelm the system with change or things start collapsing. So, it's a very good point that people need to bear in mind. And I think that, the kind of ideal that's gripped the new Supreme Court is strike while the iron is hot. And, there's
a lot of striking, though.
Blacksmithing and yeah, a lot of
there's a lot of striking going on.
Bladesmiths, but not so much for government.
I have this idea I've been mulling around, and I when I'm listening to the EPA argument and reading the decision, and I'm came into the shocking realization that these people have no idea what they're talking about in regards to ecology or the environment. When I'm listening to Scalia and Heller 2008 and the oral arguments, he's making these great arguments to 1658 English common law on the basis of the Second Amendment, and I don't agree with him, but he's making really foundational claims, and it's an interesting thought process, and I can agree with that. But I don't agree with his conclusions, but it's an interesting case that he's making. And when I'm listening to the EPA arguments, these people are talking about the ecology and these energy markets, and they're not economists. They're not scientists. It's very weird to me, and it doesn't seem to me like the founders of the Constitution would create a system where lawyers ruled on high and told us what everything was, right? It's just, lawyers are entirely optional. You actually don't need a lawyer to represent yourself in the Justice Department, in the justice system. You can represent yourself. So it just doesn't seem to me like they would create a ruling class of lawyers. And if the SCOTUS is going to make these huge, grand, sweeping changes on the environment, why not have a scientist on there? Why not have a medical doctor that's helping decide the road decisions, that kind of thing? There is no restriction on only lawyers being on SCOTUS. It could be anyone that the Senate agrees to. So how about diversifying SCOTUS and bringing in different backgrounds? It would help creating some of these decisions to be a little more understandable, in common parlance, and the more people could understand them. And I feel like just having a better background would give people a better understanding of it. Because when I'm listening to this, only Breyer is bringing any data or statistics or anything else, and I'm like, I'm really going to miss this. I'm going to miss someone bringing up data. So I don't know. What do you guys think about diversifying SCOTUS and backgrounds and bringing having more than lawyers on there?
I'll let Xandring.
I'm not directly opposed to it. I mean, there's some concerns about it too, but I'm not. I mean, in principle, I'm not opposed to it.
I think where I thought Xandring was going to go with this, and I suspect this is at least part of his thinking, is too, that was actually originally the idea, right? I mean, you were really not supposed to be a lifelong politician. People in Congress were supposed to be bankers, farmers, lawyers, run the gamut. That was the idea. The problem is, okay, hold 1 second, please. Oh, one of these days I'll get over that cough. The problem is, the world has become much more complicated than that kind of system can rely on. Even just how we get our information now has become so, it's a landmine. What news sources do you watch? How do you know that those news sources are good? Well, how do you know that what they're relying on is good? And it's so difficult to process just the day-to-day information to function, let alone what you need to make good decisions on environmental protection or any of these things. I was thinking about this when I've heard scientists, and we've heard scientists. One of my favorites is because I used to do the anti-theism thing, and so I had found scientists, PhDs, who said that they highly questioned whether or not evolution was real. Their PhDs were always in physics or something else that's a completely different, by the way. I've never seen a biologist say that, but nonetheless, you could find scientists who have legit PhDs who have said that. And that if you really look at the full text, you'll also see they'll say, well, yeah, but it's considered scientifically sound, so I'm not going to argue against it, but I don't believe it, and I haven't seen it. So even then, they're not quite thinking, they're not really saying it's not true. They're just saying, they're admitting they're not qualified to say it's not true. They just don't believe it. Okay, so what that means is, especially when you got super PACs money and all of these things that we all know about, and it take forever for me to get into, you can have a extreme minority position that is well funded that can put forward evidence in the name of a scientist or something like that that's making any claim you want. You will find somebody who can make that claim, and you can have mountains of other data. And if the people who are in office aren't paying attention or aren't qualified, the amount of things that they're going through. But nowadays, it does have to be lawyers. I don't think it was intended to be, but nowadays it has to be because there's so much minutia and the single misstep. Even the correct steps have consequences. That's actually essentially what we've been talking about, right? Which is, even if you're making the correct decision, if you made it for the wrong reasons, it has all of these consequences that echo for generations. So it's sort of like most of us aren't qualified to do that kind of thing anymore, which was not the intent, but I don't know how you get around that given the complexities. And I think you're going to get more and more layers of complexity. It reminds me of the lemon laws, which when the lemon laws first came out, fierce opposition to it because they're like, no, you're responsible to do the due diligence and know that what you're buying when it comes to a vehicle is good. And it's like, well, wait a minute. When you were buying a cart, the horse-drawn carriage, you could be reasonably expected to have enough familiarity to be able to look over it and have some idea as to whether or not it was good or not. But an engine is so complicated, a car is so complicated, the due diligence required to make an informed decision when buying a car is virtually prohibitive. You'd have to borrow the car for a while. You'd have to take it to a mechanic's shop, assuming that you don't trust the mechanic and want to do the due diligence yourself. You'd have to know so much about mechanics, and then computers, same thing. People are getting ripped off with computers all the time. So it's just gotten so complicated that we're just adding layer after layer after layer, and I don't know how to undo that. Everybody has to be more and more specialized, and the jobs of Congress has to be more specialized. I agree with you in principle. I don't want lawyers there. I certainly don't want professional politicians. I think it's a huge problem, but the universe has gotten so complicated. I don't see a practical way of really rolling that back with anything short of term limits, and that may help, but I don't think that'll solve the problem.
Well, and it can create more problems too. I mean, there's some good arguments for things like term limits, and then, and of course the arguments always boil down to, it's like, well, when you get good people in, you kind of want to keep them there. And term limits would hurt you in that respect. I mean, it's like you're getting this unexpected grab bag of stuff all the time. And even if even if you're getting some bad that's getting stuck in there forever, I mean, you can at least make plans, and you can at least have some sort of stability in what's coming next. And it creates problems as well as solves.
Well, there's the argument that I really like, actually. It's a great argument. We already do have term limits. They're called elections.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't agree with anything that limits basically like a free and fair election. You should be able to beat an 85-year-old at the polls, man. Like, I'm sorry, but like it doesn't make any sense to me. Like, even if it's an incumbent, you should be able to beat them through democracy. And the presidential term limits have created this kind of weird thing where now Congress actually has like more power than the president, and like I would argue Pelosi or McConnell actually have more power, especially McConnell.
Yeah, McConnell's proven. Yes.
He's decided the SCOTUS, right? So, and even now the federal, judges and stuff. So, he has more power than the president because he's been there for so long. He's able to, withstand multiple presidents and actually have a generational power that Obama never had, right? Even as a 2-term president, he didn't have that long of an impact on our politics. And so I don't. It's kind of an odd thing. I don't really agree with having term limits for SCOTUS either. I guess it's supposed to be the oligarchical branch of our government. It's people that are complaining about it. It's kind of like one of those things where we had a chance in 2016, could have gone three the other way, could have been, the next 45 years of a liberal Supreme Court, but that's not what happened. And it is odd that the Supreme Court's only been liberal on the liberal wing for 45 years out of the 245 years of our country, which is a little odd, but the Warren Court is going to be rare, right? So I don't know. It's just kind of it is frustrating, and I do kind of agree with you guys. Kind of like when I came in, it does feel like SCOTUS is being more and more broad, and I don't think that legislation should happen through SCOTUS, right? And that's kind of like the whole point of Congress and having representative democracies and that kind of thing. I do really wonder when the next majority is going to happen after, stare decisis has been thrown to the wind with Roe. I wouldn't expect the next radical liberal SCOTUS to care about stare decisis on a lot of this stuff. Let's just say that. I don't think that they're going to really care. So it's going to be really, I think the clapback's going to be pretty hard.
There's a slim possibility the court will be liberal again by the end of the year. And I think the reason is because, here's why. Let's assume one conservative justice goes down, either COVID, health issues, something like that. One of them, and it's not Thomas. It can't be Thomas. If it's Thomas, it's not going to happen. But let's assume that one of them goes down for some reason, and it happens. I think Thomas is going to be either impeached or resign before the end of the year. I think that's a very strong possibility because he should have recused himself in the Eastman case. He's decided 9 cases in which his wife had a conflict of interest that he did not reveal. And I think if we learn more about her participation in the January 6th, and he's decided January 6th cases, he was the sole dissent on the Eastman case, which was about releasing documents, which it turned out had private messages. They contained private messages that implicated his wife in a crime, and he was the sole
she was
dissent
taking
in
money
that.
to pay for the coup from the Venmo that he has on his SCOTUS account. Like what?
I think now Roberts is one of the most ineffectual. I shouldn't say that because we've had a lot of, but I mean he's not in recent history. He's he is, and I think the problem is he doesn't. He's been called out by other judges as being just a terrible Chief Justice, and he's losing control of the court. I was sitting there going, why didn't he vote on Casey? It's like, why didn't, and I was calling him a coward for not voting on Casey. And then I realized I think the reason he didn't vote on Casey is because I think he would have voted to strike Roe v. Wade. But I think this is going too fast for him. And I think he's concerned. So he decided not to vote because he doesn't think it should be progressing this way. Okay, that's fine. Then he needs to step up somehow. I'm wondering if there's a slip of the tongue. If Thomas brings too much, and yes, I did call him Uncle Tom in the last stream. I stand by that. Listen, I was wearing I'm sitting there going, if I'm going to say that about a Supreme Court justice, I'm going to wear a suit and tie. $400 suit, $400 tie. I doubled the cost of the show that day, but nonetheless, this
is why my salary is where it is.
It is. Well, production values. I'm just saying, it's important. So. If I think, and if Titan brought something up earlier, which I think is true, I really do think it was Ginny who released it. If it wasn't Ginny, it was a liberal. It was absolute, because liberals gained more, but I think it was Ginny Thomas who released the Alito thing. That utterly decimated the court's ability to operate because now everybody is second guessing everybody else. Nobody trusts anybody. And this institution, which has been the most secretive of all the institutions, is the U.S. Supreme Court. And all that's been destroyed. It's been destroyed on Roberts' watch. If it was destroyed by Thomas's wife, and if Thomas is now sending out these concurrent opinions, which in my view, Roberts may share it, but he's pissing on Roberts' shoes. And I think Roberts may well reach the point where, and what Titan had pointed out, and I thought this was worthwhile, is we don't know who did the leak. Why not? It's possible because they didn't find the person, but they investigated it, I think, pretty hard. I think it's 50-50. They didn't figure out who did it, or they didn't have enough to say who did it. They may know, but they can't. They're not going to say without proof. Or it was Ginny Thomas, and they don't want to implicate the wife of a Supreme Court justice, and so they're sitting on it. If it's that, it'll come out. It may take years, but it'll come out. And I think Roberts is going to act on that. I think he's going to feel he's got no choice. So if we lose a conservative judge through COVID, retiring, any number of things, and that's reasonably small. It does happen. The chances of that are reasonably small. But if that happens, I think the chances that Thomas doesn't make it through the end of the year are high. You'd lose 2 justices while Biden's in office. I'm not saying bank on it. I'm not saying be optimistic, but I am saying it's a non-trivial possibility. It's a non-trivial possibility is what I'm saying. That's the argument. All right. So, Greg, any final thoughts as we choose to wrap this up? Thank you so much for coming in. This is delightful.
Yeah,
I'm going to confess something. You had said you wanted to talk about the EPA when you came in.
Yeah.
And I was just like, well, it's an open hang, so, great, come on in. But I was just like, oh, God, we're going to have a science geek. He's going to come on and he's going to talk about the Supreme Court. And, by the way, what does SCOTUS stand for? But that judge guy who said the thing about the EPA, and I really don't like it when you say that about that. I was just like, oh, God, I'd love to have you on. You really knew what you were talking about. You had all this. I was like,
oh, thank you.
Oh, he got game. We can't bring you back. You look better than me. We've had 3 people say that so far in the live chat, and now you're competing in terms
I don't have any more. I gave you all. Okay, everything that I asked.
So, okay, so that was no. Thank you so much for coming on. You contributed spectacularly, and now because of my train of thought is completely shot. I did ask if there was anything else you wanted to say, and you seemed to say, was there anything else you wanted to, and certainly at least tell people where they can find you. But if you have any closing thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, if you care about the environment and you want to minimize our impact on the environment, I think that the decision is, very sad. But there are ways to get involved and have a huge impact on the environment, and you actually can do it through making our environment just basically conserve more species. So the ones that are dying off right now, you conserve what's here and rehabilitate the ones that are gone. And you can do that by, for example, going to your municipal governments, looking at even the zoning board commissions actually have a huge impact on creating big spaces of nature, because right now a lot of it is archipelagos, the islands of nature as opposed to one connected mess, and that has a big impact on biodiversity, and that's what we want. So check out your municipal governments. There's zoning boards and commissions that are actually unelected, so you can go in and just kind of talk to your city council member and see if they have an opening, and it matters how your municipal government happens and all that kind of stuff, but check it out for real. And there's a lot of ways at the state level too that you can do a lot to impact climate change and just in general the impact the humans are having on the environment. So don't be distressed. Try to create some action out of your frustration and change things locally, and that'll make you, at least your mental health will be a little bit better. So I have a YouTube channel, The Peer Review. The URL is thepeer.review. So check it out. And I like to do primary source kind of stuff here. So I've been, the SCOTUS oral arguments and all this kind of stuff has kind of been my side hobby. So this has been fun to talk about it with you guys.
You've been around enough. You've seen what we do. You know sort of the format and how we do different shows. You've now been on After Dark and on In Time, slightly different formats, different things. But I think you get a sense for what we do. So you are always welcome back. So if you want to discuss this further, or if you see something in the news, because you reached out to me, you're like, oh, you're doing this, I want in. So you're always welcome. You're always welcome. And if it's something that you didn't see the link, we're still probably doing it. You have some idea of how we operate. So you're always welcome. Thank you for coming. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Don't ever hesitate to hit me up. Is Andring, any final thoughts?
I'd like to
Bastard.
expand a bit.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
That was a deep. I'm sorry. I was telling
My
myself
mic
just
on?
wait till he's made the argument. Wait until he's made the argument, and then call him that, regardless of what he says. I don't really care what you say, but anyways, apologies. All right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can be a bastard. So,
to be fair,
yeah,
one of the sad things
personal-
is. You and I have talked about this before. I do want to get this out. You and I have talked about this before. There are times I'm really kind of ashamed of liberals and some of the arguments that end up getting used. You do get a very. It's not just the evil conservatives who are misrepresenting arguments and just doing it. So it's like some of the shit that you get is just like, it's like, could you listen to his argument and then call him a bastard? And preferably only if it really is what it deserves. Anyways, you get far more shit than you should. Anyway, so that was the last interruption. Please continue.
Yes, any final thoughts? Oh, and by the way, I'm going to interrupt your final thoughts.
Well, now I'm not going to interrupt him anymore. I'm just going to mute you.
Yeah. I was going to expand upon what Greg had said. When you try, one, there's kind of a quaint little throwaway line that's actually pretty impactful, which is be the change you wish to see in the world. And secondly, when you try to change vast, huge, complex systems that have taken centuries to evolve to the points that they're at, and you try and take that approach from top down, change everything, is vastly complicated. Anybody who tells you that solutions are simple are lying to you, and they're trying to propagandize you. None of this is simple. It's vastly complicated. On the other hand, it's much more simple to make changes locally because you have a better grasp of what's going on. There's fewer players involved, and you generally have to face all of these people, or these people have to face you in your local environment. But it requires more work on your part because you actually have to go out and do things. You have to get involved. You have to want to step up and take responsibility and join the board, advocate for the changes that you want to see. So it requires you to take on yourself a hell of a lot more personal responsibility. However, it's simpler to affect change at that level. And I think that we've got way too many people in the country that want somebody else to fix the problem. It's a problem. It needs to be fixed, and it should be fixed this way, and you need to go get it and get it fixed. We've abdicated our responsibilities to manage ourselves. And that really starts with your local community and building from there. If you try and take control of the top and change everything top down, you're going to find that it's incredibly difficult, unwieldy, and you'll probably fail. So, keep that in mind and go out and be the change you want to see in the world.
Well said. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Xandring, for coming on. Yeah, I'm glad we finally had a chance to. I've been running around all day. It's been insanely. It's been trying. It's been a busy day. But so we didn't get a chance to chat. I'm glad we managed to do this after dark. Thank you all for sticking with us this long. Like, subscribe, and share if you like our content. If you like any of the videos we've done in the past, sharing is a great way to help us out. Doesn't cost you a thing. And if you like the show, send it to a friend. If you don't like the show, send it to someone you don't like. But we've dropped the link for Greg, the peer review. The YouTube channel for that has been dropped, so go check that out. If you want to have more of these discussions, please feel free to join us on the Discord. I don't know, Xandring, if you're planning on going to the Discord. I know there was some interest in chatting with you there. I'm not going to be able to make it tonight, but do you... Oh, it's getting awfully late for you too. I know you're going to have to. Were you thinking of either of you, Greg, Xandring? Were you guys planning on maybe stopping in on the Discord and saying hi and chatting with anyone in the audience, or
possibly? Yeah.
All right.
I have to say possibly as well. Let me go poop because everybody needs to know I need to go poop and have for like the last hour. But it is getting late. I do have to get moving. I'm under a bad time crunch because I have a permitted load. It's oversized. So the 4th of July is
that's why you're going to poop now?
That was the toilet information.
Yeah. No, it's not. He's a truck driver. He didn't mean. But, yeah. All right.
So I'm under time crunch, so it's not like and every time I get sucked in and start talking to people, the next thing I know, I mean, this happens a lot. It's like, oh, I've really only got 5 minutes. I got to go pick my daughters up. An hour later, I'm trying to explain to my daughters why I'm not there to pick them up because you won't shut up. Time gets away from me, and next thing I know, it's like 2 a.m. and I'm like, crap, I've got to be up in like 2 hours to go drive. So
yeah, don't do that.
I will go poop and I will evaluate while on the throne because that's where all the best thinking is done. Everybody knows this. And then if you see me, you see me. If you don't, I decided that it's probably a better use of my time to sleep so that I can, drive this 81,000-pound rig down the road safely tomorrow.
Welcome everyone to After Dark. All right. Perfect. Well, and then I'm sure if anybody wants to hit up 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐬, hit him up on the Discord or hit me up and we can chat. I'm usually pretty available myself. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to be having a discussion tomorrow, 9:30 Eastern Standard, with Commander Lance McMillan. For those of you who don't know who he is, he was the head of staging for the Iraq War out of CENTCOM for the 5th Fleet. He really knows his shit, and he's made a tremendous number of predictions regarding what's going to happen in Ukraine, and so far he is right far more often than not. It's things are getting pretty desperate over there, so we're going to have him back. He's going to fill us in on what's going on, what this situation looks like both strategically and tactically, and the shows with him. He's also got a great sense of humor. It's always a lot of fun, but he has forgotten more about war, combat, and that whole 9 yards than probably all the entire audience put together ever knew. The guy's insane. So tomorrow, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard. I hope you guys will join us for that, and SCOTUS is still releasing decisions, so I'll probably see you in 15 minutes at the rate at which they're dropping shit that needs breaking news.
Retired?
Strike when the iron's hot.
Yeah, strike while. Oh, that's right. Yeah, because he submitted the letter. He said effective 24 hours. Can they not drop anything else in that time? Are they locked up?
She's sworn in today.
Oh, okay.
Woo.
Well,
it's usually Fridays. No, you're right. It's usually Fridays that they dump the big ones, but now because of Friars.
We've got to. Okay, phrasing. Just saying phrasing.
False alarm.
This show has just. Okay.
Woo. So I was like, really? So much to do.
I'm gonna take the big dump too. So
Yeah. Well, so did Trump. That was the. Oh my God, with him talking about the election, it's like he really just can't get off the toilet, can he? Okay. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow, probably in about 24 hours, but who the hell knows, given what's been going on. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow. Good night.